Hey, Rex here at RW Mods. Today we're going to look at this Novarossi Rolling. It's a 0.21 cubic inch engine. Um, has I think the only information in here is a exploded view. It does have some run-in. There's some instructions on the back. This was open previous, so get that out of the way. It's a nice looking engine. I see it has the offset carburetor, six head screws. I'm not quite sure why they go to six head screws. I'm sure it holds better. I don't know if I've ever really had a problem with four not holding good enough, but there could be a reason that they have that. The old I remember the old 8-port Novarossi had that on some of the 821. They had it on some. Some had the 4 bolt, but that 821 was a really good engine at 8-port. But 8-port, but it had really good torque for a truggy. Looks like the standard carburetor that's been coming with a lot of engines lately. Obviously, it's a different block when it has the offset carburetor. You can see that the carburetor's not centered like on most engines. I don't know where the needles on this carburetor go. This one looks to be really far in from flush. That's probably a starting position. Most Novarossis you kind of flush on the end, so this one's a little different. I see it says 7 transfert. That's 7 ports. It's probably just a little translation from Italian to English. So we'll get taken apart. I forgot my good screwdriver in the shop. Luckily, I'd already loosened these screws up. With the Novarossis, using flathead screws, it is really, really important when you're working on these to have a good screwdriver. And the ones that work for the backplate, you can use a little cheaper backplate, but it needs to be a little smaller for these screws. But the screws, you need to have a good one. And my good one, I got it at Fleet Farm. Well, Fleet Farms are kind of a Midwest thing, but I think it's made by Wiha, WIHA. Has a really nice hard tip. It's the right diameter to fit down in there. I've went through a lot of screwdrivers in the last few years. It is hard to find a good one that lasts, because these, I mean, I wish they wouldn't. I wish they'd use a regular Phillips head screws, because these a lot of people have trouble with them, and I get them in for a rebuild and they're stripped, and sometimes I've had to actually drill. I have like a little sleeve I go down in there to drill the screw out if I have to. It's kind of a pain. I wish they would just go to a regular Allen head screw. But we'll get this one taken apart and see what's inside. Okay, I got the head bolts out of it, and time to take the head button off. Actually, this one came off pretty good. Sometimes they're really tight on there. All the shims are off. We're going to put the piston at the top here. And you always want to make sure the piston's up before you pull the back plate. The bottom of the skirt of the piston can catch that coming off. Especially on these long stroke engines, there's more stroke there. And take the carb off here. And maybe the sleeve will come out. Sometimes they'll. Sometimes the sleeve with just the pinch will come out. This one didn't. We'll hook the exhaust port here with the zip tie. Push it up. Sleeve out. Piston out. And the crank out. So this has a weighted crank. We got, like I said on the head, it's a 7-port. That's counting these 2 small slits, the transfer ports, the boost. Now this engine, in looking at it, it looks similar to the Bonito, was probably the original super long stroke. And by super long stroke, this is a 15.9 diameter piston with a 17.6 stroke. So the crank is a longer stroke than most other engines, and some like a P5 would be quite a bit less stroke. And this also has I don't know, you can tell by looking at it, but it's a 14.5 millimeter crank. Like the kind of the standard crank, and even some Novarossis like the P5 have a 14 millimeter crank. This is a 0.5 millimeter larger. Takes a different bearing in the block, but I don't know if there's any really downside to the larger crank. I think it originally was made on their on-road engines so they could go a little different, or a bigger bore in the crank. This one does have maybe a 0.5 millimeter larger bore in it than like a P5 and stuff, but again, like I've said on some of the other engines, I'm not sure what they're using for a weight with the weighted crank. Hopefully it's something that's heavier than the steel. This one is a steel bearing, steel rear bearing, and the Novarossi double sealed front bearing. I do kind of like that bearing. It's fairly expensive from the factory, but it has 2 seals on the outside and then no seal on the inside. So it does do a good job keeping the dirt out. It's not, I mean, you still need to replace it, and it lasts a little bit longer than some standard bearings, but this one doesn't look like it has, yeah, this one has the standard rear bearing. There's a couple things I don't like about Novarossi, and one of them being is they went to a special rear bearing, and the inner race is thinner on some, and then there's a boss behind the bearing that if you use a standard bearing, the inside and outside dimensions are the same, but the race is thinner, and you can't just put a standard 14.5 millimeter bearing in there. So then you have to buy the bearing from Novarossi. There is a manufacturer, TKO, makes a replacement. They're a little more expensive than some standard bearings, but like $35 isn't too bad. They make it for one of the sizes, but I can't remember, because they do it on both the 14 and 14.5 millimeter cranks. So that's something to look out for. And I think when you're buying an engine, if you can find that out ahead of time, because it can be a pain. I do a service where I machine the block with the bearing out. I'll machine the block so a standard bearing will fit in there, but that's $15, or you can buy the TKO bearing to replace it. This is kind of different. It's machined out right here for their logo. I'm not really sure why that is on that side. Like I said before, the crank, or the the carb is offset, and so the crank is different also. If you look at the crank, I'm not 100% why they did the offset. I mean, obviously, you do something different, it's cool, it sells more. But I think, when they first did that, it was on the on-road engines. And my theory on that was you get a better balance with the crank because your crank window is kind of lined up with your crank pin. So the weight is better for the balance. So you're lighter on the top side because you want your weight to offset the piston. At the bottom of the stroke, it's offsetting the piston, and so I think they did it for a little better balance on road high revving engines. And then they already obviously got the blocks and stuff, so it doesn't really cost them anymore to use that block for a different engine. So Novarossi cranks are generally they're good quality. The crank pins wear well on the uncoated even, so cranks and rods are pretty strong. This is I'm not sure what the part numbers are on these, but so you can't take a crank from a different that doesn't have the offset carb and use it in this engine. It has to be from an offset carb. One thing they do too is they usually the notch for the sleeve on a lot of engines is either on the exhaust port side or the intake side. And well, on these, to prevent you from using a different bore and stroke in this engine, or I think the Bonito's that way too. They offset it to the side, and it doesn't really affect performance. It just you have to be careful when you're using parts from different engines. Going back to the sleeve, I always kind of thought that was kind of neat, the way they do the bypass port. If you don't know what a bypass port is, so the piston's going up and down, and we're centered there. So the piston, as it goes down, it lets air out from underneath the piston out, and it kind of gives it that little bit of, there's dead space underneath the piston otherwise. So as the piston's going down, the air comes out and gets in with the intake charge there. So I've always kind of liked that. I'm not. There's a lot of engines that don't have bypass ports anymore. They're kind of getting away from that. But I was always kind of a fan of the bypass port. It's a little more machining, especially in this one. They're kind of relieving it there. 3-port exhaust. There's pluses and minuses to that. It usually adds top end to an engine. Going to the head, this is probably one of the lower heads that Novarossi makes. They have some clearances cut in it for exhaust and carb side. Pretty nice. They're a pretty nice head. Cool well. Nothing too fancy on the back plate here. You'll notice the cut's a little bit deeper because the stroke is longer on this engine where the piston comes down farther, so there's a little deeper notch in that. Going to the carb, 7mm restrictor. Looks to be, it's a long low speed needle carb. Pretty standard for the Novarossi. They look to have changed this a little bit. And some of the older Novarossi cars didn't have the third needle. That's just changing your spray bar adjustment. So if you were to screw this in a half turn, and if the thread pitches were the same on the low speed needle, it'd be equal to adjusting the low speed needle. And sometimes you can get the spray bar in a little bit more, So you need to work together with the low-speed needle, and there is some differences. I have played with it on a carb before, and it did make a tuning difference, but it's not a drastic change. You're better off just, unless you're really experienced and want to play around, leaving that alone. Well, I guess that's about it on this. I did a little research. These I saw them priced between $219 and $265. Um, this engine, to me, I guess we'll go through the timing numbers now. Um, so the some of the higher end Novarossis do have some nice induction numbers. So the blowdown, which is the degrees between the exhaust port and the intake port. Some people take that number times 2 and stuff, but it depends on what program you're using. I'm getting 33 degrees on this engine, which seems kind of low. Like I like to be up in the 40s, but it does have a pretty wide exhaust port that does play into that too. But I like to see probably in the 40s with that. What that will do, you put it up into the 40s, will give it more top end. So this, as it is, should have just a stump puller. And opening 151, closing is 62 degrees for a total of 213, which is pretty good. I don't like to go much over 220. Some engines are up to 220. So those numbers really, this engine with some modifying, I'd probably move more in the blowdown, change the blowdown than the other numbers, but they're pretty good numbers. So going back to the price, I saw it was quite a range from 219 to 265. One thing I guess I'd stated before, I wasn't real keen on Novarossi going to that kind of special rear bearing. It seemed like they were kind of trying to screw the customer a little bit, or kind of get them to buy their rear bearing and stuff. But another thing, like a few years ago, I actually used to be a dealer for Novarossi and had a dealer. The importer got engines through the importer and sold them. But a few years ago, they kind of opened it up to any importer, and so they had, I don't know how many they have now, but they had up to 3 different importers and stuff. Well, then there was one, I'm not going to name names or anything, but there was one importer that basically, when I contacted them about a dealer price list, they said they don't have a dealer price list, and that they sell to online at dealer prices, which for some people is a good deal. If I go to the track nowadays and if someone's not sponsored, they most likely run a Novarossi, or if they don't have an engine deal, or because you can get them quite a bit cheaper than some of the other engines. They're Italian engines. They're pretty good materials. They last quite a while. I'm really nothing too negative to say about them. But what it kind of changed the way engines sold in the U.S. I used to be an importer for Argus engines. I used to sell Alpha engines, and then I imported the Argus engines for a few years. And then when I got out of selling the Argus, was about time that this Novarossi thing, because it was hard for me to sell even $150 to $200 Argus Taiwan-made engine when you could buy a Novarossi for $130, $140. So to me, that's kind of when I quit importing Argus engines. So basically, the Novarossi distributors kind of changed the way things work in the U.S. anyways, as far as engines, and there's probably less dealers because of it. Another thing too is the I see online a lot of questions like which engine's for me. We got the Rolling, we got the Mephisto, Mephisto, we got the P5, Elite 5. Um, if you're looking for a super long stroke engine, which I'm not 100% like, I don't run the super long stroke much, so I don't really have an opinion on how it works. I do know that some on-road engines have it. So is it more of a top end engine, and I've heard they're a torque engine for a truggy and stuff. They work kind of both applications. But one thing I will kind of say, like, you can make a P5 on most tracks for a average guy will have enough power. Kind of tune it with your pipe and restrictors, and it'll be plenty. Like this engine at 220 to 265 is probably on the upper range. Um, if you can get an engine for 150 or less, or even get 150 or less and get it modified, kind of tune it to the way you want. So there's a lot of choices, and especially in the Novarossi brand, and it is kind of hard to know which one is for you. I will say this on the track, this one has the offset carb. On the track, this thing is going to perform pretty much like a Bonito. The timing numbers are within a couple degrees on everything, so between this and a Bonito, if you can pick up the Bonito a little cheaper, probably go that route. Sometimes a ceramic bearing engine will be a little bit more money too. Although, I mean, when I rebuild an engine, I'll put a ceramic in it because there's $10 difference in the bearing. But there's nothing wrong with the steel bearing. I've never talked to someone that replaced a standard bearing with a steel bearing with a ceramic and said, "Wow, I could really feel a difference." Is it better? Yes, it's less rotating mass, it's a little smoother, whatever, but it's not going to be a noticeable difference. Um, so I guess all in all, good engine should perform well. This one's going to get modified, and we're going to do some work on it. One thing I didn't touch on is a lot of Novarossis come pretty tight piston to head clearance. So as the piston's at the top dead center and there's not much squish band there, or squish on there, they come shimmed a little tighter than a lot of engines, but they also then run a colder plug. This is it's a C7, so it's a 7 Novarossi plug is pretty cool. So what that does is, if you were to replace this, I see some guys, I get them in the rebuild, they have a OSP3 plug in there. Well, the piston to head clearance works well on the Novarossi. It's probably more towards a 25%. I personally, if you're running 30%, I'd add a 4,000 shim to this, and then maybe run a 6 plug. You'll probably idle a little bit better, a little more low end. That's probably what I would recommend for this engine and most Novarossi engines. Not all, but most Novarossis come a little bit, about 4 thousandths less than what I like to see. And if you're one that takes apart your own engines, you'll see it. You'll see pitting look like it's sandblasted. Now, it didn't ruin the engine or anything, but you'll see when you take your engine apart, it'll be sandblasted, and that kind of is the telltale sign that you've had some pre-ignition. So it's basically piston it's firing before it gets to the top, and it is kind of hard on rods and cranks, rod bushings and stuff too, because it's actually you want to be firing as the piston's going down, and it'll actually fire before it gets to the top, so it's kind of working against itself. So if you do notice like a sandblast, it can be either a bearing coming apart or pre-ignition. So I think they tune a little bit better with adding a shim. Power difference, it will be negligible. So this is Rex at RW Mods, and thanks for watching.